Good morning. I'm Gary Oliver, and I'm the director of the Center for Healthy Relationships and professor of psychology and practical theology here at JBU. And I'm really excited, in all honesty, to have the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite encounters with Christ. Many of those who may have encountered Christ probably heard him talk about joy, because he has a lot to say about joy. But unfortunately, during this pandemic, with the wide range of losses, and even some of us have suffered some major losses in our lives and our families, folks haven't experienced very much joy. In John 15:11, during the Last Supper, Christ told his disciples, "These things I've spoken to you, so that you may be filled with my joy, and that your joy may overflow." That reminds me of what Paul said, Ephesians 3:20, "Now unto him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly beyond all we ask or think." So Christ just didn't say, "I want you to have joy once in a while," but I want you to be filled with my joy. Now, I was first trained as a theologian, and so in the 5 years I spent earning my MDiv and THM, I studied Greek and Hebrew. I went through the various words for joy and wrote papers on them. I gave sermons on them. I included some material on joy in some of my books. So I kind of knew a lot about joy. However, it took a long, dark, and very painful, about 7-year winter in my life for me to really understand what God's joy really is and how to actually experience. Let me give you a short backstory. In 2005, my dad, under several hospitalizations, went to be with the Lord. And 2 months after my dad died, my late wife, Carrie, God gave her a couple more years, but she was diagnosed with metastatic pancreatic cancer. In 2006, I had my 5th cancer surgery with chemotherapy and radiation. In 2007, my middle son, Matt, died. And 2 months later, my wife of then 27 years, Carrie, died. A year later, in 2008, my only sibling, my sister Marcia, died. So in 4 years, I had 4 funerals. By that time, I'd buried my entire family of origin and half of my current family. There obviously aren't words to describe any one of those losses, but the impact of those 4 losses together was more than difficult, more than devastating. 2 years later, I went down to MD Anderson for my 7th cancer surgery, and they had to remove 80% of my tongue. They took muscle off my leg, put it in my mouth. So right now, 20% of what I'm speaking with is my real tongue. 80% is muscle off my legs. So, some folks have their foot in their mouth. I have my whole leg in my mouth. I was told I'd never speak again. I was told that I wouldn't be able to swallow or eat or chew. I'd be on a feeding tube the rest of my life. It took me 6 months just to learn how to say my ABCs, and I sounded like an intoxicated Elmer Fudd. And then a couple months later, after my major surgery, I went back to MD Anderson, and they said that 2 of the tumors had come back, that I had advanced stage 4 inoperable cancer. I had less than 3 months to live to go home and call hospice. I have never experienced a longer or colder or darker winter in my life, and quite frankly, many days success was just putting one foot in front of the next. One of my boys' favorite stories growing up was Alexander's terrible, awful, horrible, no good, very bad day. Well, I had a terrible, awful, horrible, no good, very bad 7 years. And in the middle of it, I felt a strong prompting from God to do a deep dive into joy. I thought I knew about it, but I discovered some things. I discovered that knowing what the Bible says about something and knowing how and when to apply it are often 2 different things. I discovered that the primary purpose in Christ's teaching was that his disciples, you and I, experience joy. There are over 200 times the word joy, joyful, and joyous are found. And there are over 200 times that the verb rejoice is found. And I discovered that joy is much different than happiness. Happiness has its root word in the word chance. So if by chance good things happen to us, we feel happy. But if by chance bad things happen to us, we are unhappy. You see, happiness is determined by our circumstances. God's joy is independent of our circumstances. And we can experience God's joy in the middle of hard times. So I asked God to teach me how to experience his joy. And during this time, God taught me 4 simple choices. By simple, I don't mean easy or simplistic, but in this short time, let me just share these 4 with you. Number 1, he taught me to choose to set my mind on things above. You know, research tells us that 80% of our thoughts are negative. We can let all kinds of stuff rob us of joy. Fear, anxiety, the tyranny of the negative what-ifs. Almost all of our what-ifs are negative. We catastrophize, we do all or nothing thinking, we ignore the positive. In Colossians 3:2, that's why Paul says, set your mind on things above. And in Philippians 4:8, whatever's true, honorable, right, pure, lovely, he goes on, let your mind dwell, abide on these things. Our mind tends to go automatically to negative things. So we have to choose to set our mind on things above. The second choice is choose to count your blessings and be thankful. It's so easy to focus, again, on the negative and to forget the blessings, to kind of ignore our blessings. Most of you can see. Most of you can hear. Most of you walked into the room that you're in right now. You sat down in the chair. All of you, thank goodness, are clothed. Most of you had food if you wanted some today. You'll have some later. But when's the last time we have thanked God for our sight, our hearing, our ability to walk, our clothes, our food? Most of you have all at your tongue. You can go to a restaurant, eat whatever you want, when you want. Before I had the surgery, I never thanked God for my tongue. I took it for granted. Now, you might say, well, Gary, that's a small thing. Yeah, but no. So many of those things I mentioned are really a big deal. So choose to count your blessings and be thankful. Number 3, choose to claim God's promises. One of my most powerful discoveries is that God's promises are more powerful than Satan's pessimism. I can believe my mood or I can believe God. Now, a problem focus, if I choose to focus on the problem, that brings fear, and fear blinds us to hope. So pretend this is a problem. If I hold it out here, I can see it's a normal-sized book. But the more I stare at it, the closer it comes to my face, this blocks out everything else. In fact, if I walk to the edge of the Grand Canyon and I have this in front of my face, I can say, from my perspective, this book is larger than the entire Grand Canyon. Well, you know that if I'm serious, I'm more than a few bubbles off plumb. Something's wrong because this is a normal-sized book. But our perspective can determine our reality. And that's why a promise focus gives us faith. A promise focus gives us hope. So a problem focus gives us fear. It blinds us to hope, and we feel hopeless and helpless. A promise focus gives us faith. It gives us hope, and we can see things from God's perspective. It doesn't eliminate our problems. And my friends, these choices aren't about pretending everything's fine and going to some psychological la-la land. It's about embracing the reality of what's going on around us, but putting it in the context of who God is, of what he's promised, of who we are because of whose we are. In my 35 years as a clinical psychologist, I've never had a client come because they had positive what-ifs. It was always the negative and the fears and the anxieties. And I've discovered with all my clients that in life, our focus becomes our filter. And that's why choosing to set our minds, to count our blessings, to claim God's promises, helps us put the challenging reality of what's going on around us, it helps that become in perspective. When we step and face our fears with faith, amazing things can happen. Choice number 4, choose to obey and act on what you know to be true. Or in the words of Nike, just do it. Now, friends, that's simple again. But like I said at the outset, simple and easy aren't synonyms. Simple and simplistic aren't the same thing. I've learned. And the reason why I told you my story is that I wanted you to know that what I was about to share wasn't just some positive thinking stick. But what I'm saying to you has come out of the furnace of real fire, real darkness, real tears, real pain, and real loss. And what I'm saying made a massive difference in my life and in the lives of many folks I've shared it with. God's joy is much more than a mood. A mood invades us. We can't choose our moods. Bad moods happen. But defiant joy is always a choice. And I say defiant because when I choose joy, I defy my circumstances. I acknowledge them, but I say that God's peace and God's promises are more powerful than my circumstances. I learned that the victorious Christian life is a life that's lived beyond moods. It's a life in which we can choose defiant joy and refuse to become the puppets of our problems and the slaves of our circumstances. You see, regardless of my mood, regardless of your mood, we can always choose to set our minds on things above. We can always choose to count our blessings. We can always choose to claim God's promises. And we can always choose to obey and act on what we know to be true. Again, it's not magic. My problems didn't disappear. I still have pain from the losses. And yet, in the midst of my sorrow, in the midst of tears that I cried so often that I ran out of tears and I was weeping dry tears, in the midst of that, God gave me a joy, a sense of His presence, and a sense that it was going to be okay. And my friends, God was faithful again and again and again, and He continues to be faithful. So now what? Well, I'd like to invite you to join me for the next 7 days, not the next month or the next year, but just for the next 7 days to choose defiant joy, to practice those 4 simple, basic choices. Is it simple? Yes. Is it easy? No. But hey, you've got nothing to lose, huh? In John 16:20 and 23 and 24, Christ said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, that you will weep and lament, but your sorrow will turn to joy. If you shall ask the Father for anything, He will give it to you in my name." And here it is. Ask, and you will receive, that your joy may be made full. This is sound biblical teaching, but it's sound biblical teaching that's been tested in the furnace of major, massive losses. And I can tell you that choosing a faith focus makes a difference. I hope and pray that some of you will join me in making these 4 simple choices. And I promise you that it will make a difference. JBU, God bless you. And may you have a special week this week. Thank you.